Leila Taylor, welcome back to the Witch Wave and welcome to our first recorded episode on video. Hello.
I'm honored. I'm honored and thrilled.
I am so honored that you're here, and I was so excited to do this with you because, as I've told you many, many times, you are one of my favorite thinkers and writers. And so when I was like trying to get courageous and make the leap finally into video, I was like, well, Leila, A, you're close by. Let's be honest.
Exactly.
And B, I just knew that we were going to have a great conversation. So first of all, congratulations on your new book. This is Sick Houses, Haunted Homes, and the Architecture of Dread. And it's your follow-up to Darkly, Black History and America's Gothic Soul.
Mm-hmm.
So why haunted houses? Why was that the topic that you landed on and just knew you wanted to dive into next?
Well, the haunted house has always been my favorite horror movie genre. And after Darkly, I was kind of diving into fiction. So I started writing a haunted house story. And I got fixated on this particular photograph that I saw that's in the book. It's like in the introduction to the book of a slave quarters or a slave house in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
And its architecture is so strange and eerie. And even before I knew what it was, I thought there's something odd and wrong about this structure. And then later I found out that it was a slave house.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, well, there you go, you
Mm-hmm.
know? And as I was doing my research for this fiction novel, I got really, really into the research part of it. And I realized that's kind of where my passion was actually digging into sort of the cultural history, getting into the movies and things like that. And that's, I'm also not a great fiction writer. I realize that myself.
I doubt that. I would love to see anything that you write, or read anything that you write in the fictional world. You're going to be incredible at it, but carry on.
But I've also always been fascinated by houses and homes. Like I kind of fall in love with buildings. I get kind of haunted, so to speak, by certain buildings for whatever reason they are. And I didn't want to talk about just about haunted houses because what I was really interested in is what is haunting, what is ghostly, what is eerie, what is um uh macabre about homes and houses that we use in fiction, that we use in movies. Like, why is the home such a mainstay of horror? Why is the haunted house? Basically, it was the first haunted Gothic novel, Castle of Otranto.
Yep.
Haunted house story. Why does this genre stick for so long in so many different ways? And I think it's because it's our home.
Right.
It's not just a house. It's about how we interact with these buildings, whether it's, a Victorian mansion or a suburban, tract house or whatever. This place that is our most intimate space, our most private space, the place where we're supposed to feel the safest and the most comfortable.
Yep.
The haunted house is an invasion of that space.
Yes.
And it's kind of the most personal kind of invasion you can have. And I kind of compare it to Exorcist movies.
Yeah.
Because I feel like it's the same thing. It's about an entity taking over
a
yourself.
Vessel, your private vessel.
Exactly.
Whether it's where you're living or the body that our spirit dwells in.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I have to admit, like, when you first sent me the arc for this, and I was so honored I got to read it early. I was so excited. But when you sent me the arc, I was like, haunted houses. That's interesting. Because I will totally admit, like, I'm such a wuss. I don't think I've ever been in a haunted house, like one of the, like at an amusement park. At an amusement park or for Halloween. Like, I'm so scared.
Yeah.
I don't like things popping out at me.
Just so you know, me too.
Really?
I hate the haunted house attractions. I never go to haunted houses on Halloween. Because me too.
Yeah.
I'm chicken.
Right.
I
It's
hate jump
terrifying.
scares. Yeah.
Jump scares are the fucking worst.
I never go to haunted houses on
Right?
Halloween.
Yeah, I've never done that. I've also never been on a water slide, and I feel like there's probably some connective tissue there. I can't figure it out right now. But
Yeah.
and so at first I was like, is that what this is about? And then I was like,
Mhm.
oh, no, no, no. This is about the trope of haunted homes and haunted spaces that captures our imagination, certainly in horror movies, but also some of these spaces are like real life spaces.
Yeah.
They're not just fiction. You have some, real homes and you
Yeah.
tell the real stories of those homes.
Yeah.
And you kind of categorize all of these under this rubric, sick houses. So
Mhm.
can you break down that title for us?
It actually came from a Shirley Jackson book, The Haunting of Hill House.
Mm-hmm.
And in the book, the narrator describes Hill House as being a sick house, that there's something wrong with it, that there's something kind of evil inherent in it, that it's diseased. I think they call it a diseased house or a psychotic house. And again, because I kind of feel like houses are sort of human in their
Mm-hmm.
own way,
Mm-hmm.
I like the idea of a sick house or a crazy house or a psychotic house
Yeah.
or a diseased house.
Yeah.
Because it feels visceral and it feels of the body,
Mm-hmm.
So that's where the term sick houses came is from
It's
Shirley
wonderful.
Jackson.
And you break the idea of the sick house into these different categories, these different chapters. And maybe you can walk us through some of them. Like, what is
Mhm.
the taxonomy of the sick houses?
Well, I start off, the first chapter is American Houses. And that's really about what the house means to us culturally
Mm-hmm.
and what home ownership means to us culturally.
Mm-hmm.
Because so much a part of the quote unquote American dream is home ownership.
Yep.
And your identity as an American often is tied into home ownership.
Yep.
And a lot of horror movies play on that. They play on the vulnerability that people have when buying a home. They
Mm-hmm.
play on the financial stress that people have about owning a home. So it talks about what it means, how home ownership became sort of the goal as an American, and what it means when you move into a new house.
Yep.
Like again, another trope that happens in horror movies all the time is the walkthrough with the real estate
Realtor.
agent, yeah,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
who's kind of shady and is keeping a little secret.
Yep.
There's always question like, why is this so cheap? Why has this been on the market for so long?
Yes, indeed. Yep.
There's the what's the catch
Mm-hmm.
scenario.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's sort of the process of moving into a home and taking ownership over that space. And I think, again, if it's a pre-owned home, or maybe even not, you're kind of picking up someone else's story.
Mm-hmm.
I think all that residue, for lack of a better word, or the history
I
of
love
those
the word
spaces.
residue.
Right. I also like
Yes.
traces. I
Yeah.
like the traces of what was left behind might still be there. So
Yeah.
you're kind of picking up someone else's story.
Yes.
And yeah, so I think not only do horror movies play along that idea, but I think the idea of whether or not your home is really yours
Yes.
is kind of an important idea.
Yep.
Like, why are renters thought less of than owners?
Mm-hmm.
I think, yeah.
So some of the films that you talk about, I'm sure listeners would even guess. I mean, we talk about Poltergeist. You talk about in the book. You talk about the Amityville Horror,
Hmm.
and then I was really happy that you talked about the Jordan Peele film "It's Us," right? That
Hmm.
you write about in the
Yeah.
book,
Yeah.
which that movie just is so chilling and so disturbing. Spending time with it again via your words was like such an uncomfortable in a good way experience. Because
Hmm.
when I saw the film, it was one of those movies that I was like, I don't know if I can ever watch this again because it really chilled me. So,
Mm.
how did you decide which of the films you wanted to tell in the story of the
Mhm.
American Houses section?
Well, I think Amityville Horror was a big one. One, because it also is a real house that has its own story. And the real story sort of overlaps the fictional film. Um, but one of the big touch points in that movie is this is their first home.
Mhm.
This is a big step. It's a blended family. They're taking that, next, vital step on the rung to, fulfillment or whatever. And the fact that it's not easy for them, that they're going into this space knowing that something really, really, really horrible happened there, and that's why they got it cheap.
Mhm.
And the thing I loved about Amityville Horror is because they have that conversation up front. The immediate question is, do we want to actually move into a space where this horrible thing happened?
Exactly. Is it worth
And they
it?
do. Is it worth it?
Mhm.
Exactly. And finance plays a big role in their decisions. Like there's some other movies that are like this where they sink all of their money into this property
Mhm.
that's their dream house. Again, like it's not just any other house. It's the big house. It's the house where they're going to grow their family. It's the
Mhm.
house where their business is going to develop. They put all of their money into it. So what do you do when ghosts or entities or monsters or creatures are trying to drive you out?
Yep.
When all of your, livelihood is placed into this thing and making those decisions based on money
Yep.
of what's worth it. Yeah.
It feels too, at least in American culture, like buying a home is supposed to be this marker of adulthood,
Mhm.
like this rite of passage. And to me, some of the haunted houses, they they sort of strike me that there are these spaces where you feel like you're finally in charge of your life.
Yeah.
And it's like,
Yeah.
no,
You're
you're
not.
not.
You're not at all.
Something else is
Yeah.
still in charge.
Yeah.
And that lack of control, or that this realization that you're not as in control of your like destiny as
Yeah.
you thought you were, it
Yeah.
is really unsettling too, right?
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of films, and once you start noticing it, and you see it everywhere. There's often a dad who's the patriarchal figure of the family, who's supposed to be the breadwinner,
Mhm.
who's supposed to be in charge of this situation, who's responsible for all this, who realizes that they are not in charge.
Yep.
That no matter what they do, they're not the ones in control of their home anymore. A lot of alcoholics. A lot of horror movies have alcoholic
I mean,
dads
The
who start
Shining,
drinking. Exactly.
hello.
Yeah.
Would you consider The Shining I guess it's not really a home, it's a
Yeah.
hotel.
Yeah. The
Yeah,
Shining was one of those where it's like, I want to talk about it, but it's like, I gotta limit. I gotta
of
limit the number.
course, of course, of course.
Yeah.
And something you write in the book that I love, you write, "A ghost is the ultimate invasion of privacy." And then later you say, "A house that is haunted is a house under constant surveillance."
Hmm.
So it's this idea too of like we're constantly being watched or listened to by
Yeah.
some entity. And it got me thinking as well of like how that is true now of our phones, our
Yeah.
computers.
Yeah.
I do not use Google Home or Alexa or any of
Oh,
those
me neither.
things.
Me neither.
And we had one briefly. And then, all the stories came out about like it's listening to you all the time. And of course, this phone probably is too, as we
Yeah.
know. And yet there's something about, I don't know,
G-
psychically it being like this little orb just
Yeah.
in your home that makes me go
Yeah.
like,
Not
that
e-
feels haunting to
and
me
not
in a
even just
way.
in your home, but somehow in control of your home.
Yep.
Like I know that there's sort of a new sort of theme that's come up in a lot of horror movies where there is some sort of digital home helper
Mm-hmm.
that's taken over,
Yes.
and where your electricity, your heat, your food, all the things that you're supposed to have control over are taken over by this machine, this computer.
Exactly. Exactly.
I feel like we're halfway there anyway as a
Leila, don't
society.
say it. Don't say it.
Sorry.
One thing I wanted to bring up before we move into the next kind of house, but with American houses, I didn't realize that there was a court case in 1991 that's colloquial called the Ghostbusters ruling.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So there was a case where, oh my God, now I'm gonna mess the name up.
Stambovsky versus
Versus Ackley,
Ackley. Yep.
yes. Where this fellow bought a house and it was in escrow. He's in the process of buying this
Mhm.
house and realized that it was getting a lot of ghost tours, a lot of tourists, a lot of like ghost hunters. There was a lot of activity happening on his property. And it turns out that that house was notorious for being haunted.
Oh
It
my
was thought
god.
of as being haunted, right?
Mhm.
So and I think the original owner actually would post articles in like the paper, like, come see the ghost house or whatever. Like they weren't
Okay.
hiding it.
So this was like a tourist
It was known.
destination. Okay,
It was
okay.
known, like, people would go to take pictures of
Mhm,
the ghost house.
mhm.
He didn't know that. So he sued, to cut the deal and get his house back, and he won. And it wasn't that and I think it's the first case about a haunted house or a house being haunted, or suing someone over a haunted house. And it isn't so much about proving that there's a ghost, about
Right.
proving that it's actually haunted, but the reputation of
Yes.
it being haunted was enough to cause, mental strife and enough to
Exactly.
get him out of the deal.
Was
Yeah.
it that he was disturbed by the notion that it even could have been haunted and it should have been disclosed? Or was it more that these people were like trespassing on
I
his
thi
house because
yeah.
they wanted to take pictures or have tours or whatever?
Yeah, I don't think I never read anything about, him being anxious or worried about ghosts. I think
Okay.
it really was about, like, invasion of privacy and
Interesting.
and if you found out that your home was a tourist attraction. I think just recently, the Carrie Bradshaw
Oh,
house in Sex and the
yes.
City,
The
she's
brownstone in
yeah,
Manhattan.
yeah.
Yep.
So the owner is getting a fence because people are getting their picture taken and they're going up to the
Exactly.
door. So
Exactly. So it's
that's
more
what
of
it
a
was.
nuisance than a
Yeah,
haunting.
yeah.
Um, I'm so interested though in this notion that some houses have this reputation. And I'm curious, like, does a realtor have to disclose, like, if someone is like brutally murdered in a
Yeah.
house, for example? Like, what
Yeah.
is there a legality around that you're aware of?
Depends on the state.
Okay.
Um, Most states have disclosure laws, where or some kind of disclosure laws. And I'm also talking to someone who's never bought a house.
Mhm.
So,
Mm,
this is a
mm.
lot of not my own personal
Mhm,
experience, but
mhm,
research.
mhm.
And usually it's if there was structural damage, if there was a lot of repairs, if there was something about the property that might cause problems for the owner later on, they would need to disclose that. But there's also, another type of disclosure, and, I'm gonna forget the name of it, yeah,
Schmockenblechern.
exactly, it's one of those. It's a really good word that I can't remember at the top of my but, it's when someone died, not of natural causes, but if there was a violent death in the house or a suicide. There are some states where and this law has changed.
Mhm.
So don't quote me on what's happening right now in
Sure.
2025 because it
Okay.
changed.
I
But
won't be
that was
litigious with you, Leila, I
right. Thank you.
promise.
Please don't
Yes.
sue me.
Yes.
Have a little footnote at the end of this saying, please don't
Exactly.
take any legal advice.
Disclaimer.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Um, uh,
But some realtors have to disclose if something awful happened in
yeah.
a
If
house?
they're stigmatized property. Knew it
Stigmatized
was going to come to me. That's what it
property.
called, a stigmatized property.
Whoa.
And that's like if a murder happened or something. So
Yeah.
if your dear old grandmother died peacefully in her bed,
You don't
that's
have to tell
that's
anybody.
fine. But if, there was a gruesome murder like the Amityville house,
Yeah.
in some states at one point you would have to use that as part of the
That's
disclosure.
so interesting. And do you think it's because there is some belief that there might be
Yeah.
an unsettled ghost or presence? Like
Yeah.
why do you have to tell about one and not the other in some of these states? In your
Yeah.
theory, in your
I think because for some people, it is a big enough decision and a big enough line in the sand to not purchase something.
Mhm.
I think in in some way in our minds or whatever, even if you don't believe in ghosts or not, knowing that something that the house has that kind of violent history is disturbing to people.
But
And if
isn't
they
that
find it,
so interesting
yeah,
though?
yeah,
Because that's to me it is a signal that there is some I don't know, superstition,
Yeah.
or there's something
Yeah.
in us that senses,
Yeah.
because otherwise you'd be like, "Who cares?" Right?
Right.
You'd
It
be
was in the
like,
past. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right. Why
Yeah.
if someone died peacefully versus not, the
What does
fact
that
yeah,
leave?
what is it exactly, the
Mhm.
residue, getting
Yeah.
back to the residue again. Oh my
Yeah.
god, I'm getting the creeps.
Yeah. Yeah.
Speaking of stigmatized homes or
Yes.
stigmatized houses, I mean, that could be like a it's not as good of a title as your
It's a good
your
one.
title is, but that's what a lot of these
It's a
different
sick
homes
house.
are that you write about.
Mhm.
The next section you write about, excuse me, you write about what you call brutal houses.
Mhm.
I love this section so much, and I love it even more now because I just saw the film The Brutalist.
Which I haven't seen yet.
It was brutal. I know
Oh.
everyone's saying that. Well, here's what I'll
Okay.
say. Here's what I'll say. So
Okay.
Matt and I went this past weekend. In the theaters, it's like a 3.5 hour movie. There's an
Yeah.
intermission.
There's an
And
intermission?
yeah.
I
And
didn't know that.
the first half, like we got to the intermission, I was like, honey, I love this.
Yeah.
This is so good. This is like true, like, cinema. Like it just felt like an epic, beautifully made film.
Yeah.
And then, in my opinion,
Okay.
in the next half of the movie, they just make some big melodramatic swings, and the writing of it and how the
Oh.
characters navigate some of the things that are revealed. It's just so over the
Oh.
top. And if
Yeah.
they just like restrained it a little more, I think it would
Yeah.
have been stronger. And instead they really go for the like Oscar moments in a way that I'm like, oh my God. However, the for listeners that aren't aware, the whole film is essentially about this architect. I think it's a fictionalized guy. I don't think
Mhm.
he's a real architect who actually existed, but he's an architect. He's a Jewish man. He's a World War II. I mean, immigrant, expat.
Mhm.
He's fleeing, and in his prior life, and this is not a spoiler, it's revealed pretty early on in the film, you then know or you come to be aware that he was this amazing architect in the brutalist style.
Mhm. Mhm.
And again, I'm not giving too much away. The meat of the film is that this past of his is discovered and he gets commissioned to design this epically huge, monumental building in
Uh-huh.
Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And because you haven't seen it and because people watching or listening haven't seen it, I don't want to spoil the end, but
Yeah.
I will say that the thesis statement of your book and this movie, like
Oh.
there's a lot of resonance there.
Okay.
So essentially, this section of brutal houses, you're talking about the brutalist style of architecture
Mhm.
and how that style of architecture is well, why don't you actually? Because I'm just gonna like tell you about your own book now. Tell me why you decided to focus on brutalist architecture and
Yeah.
that movement in a book about sick
Yeah.
houses.
Well, again, I started with a movie or book, A Clockwork Orange,
Mm-hmm.
also High Rise, the J.G. Ballard book, and the movie that came from that, High Rise. Um, and also some horrible situations that have happened in those kinds of housing. And I kind of worked backwards from there.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the brutalist architecture ethos is like concrete was relatively new in terms of building sort of housing. It was cheap. It was using materials that were sourced in the land. It was kind of a proletariat everyman material that could be molded into anything. So there was a lot of possibilities
Mm-hmm.
in concrete.
Yep. It's
And
almost like the Play-Doh of architecture.
yeah,
You can like put it
yeah,
into any
into
form or any
anything.
mold.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So ingrained in the material, so to speak, is a kind of idealistic notion about architecture that we could build homes that would better people's lives socially somehow.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things, there are two different types of concrete homes or brutalist homes. There's kind of the super villain James
The
Bond, the
lair.
Lair,
Yes.
which is extravagant and kind of cold and maybe sort of empty and also seemingly architecturally impossible.
Mm.
Like you see these photos of a home sort of cantilevered over a cliff and it looks like it just fall into the sea.
Yes.
Homes that have so much space, there's very little in them
Mhm.
because there's so much space. So it's a very minimalist thing.
Mhm.
Um, and all those things do not read like home to people. They don't read like intimacy.
Mm.
That's why they think of them as being layers.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and then, so there's like the fancy concrete homes,
Mhm.
but concrete also became the building material for housing developments, for institutions, for government buildings, for schools and things like that, where it was kind of quantity, you know?
Yes, yes.
Um, but again, the idea of concrete was to how can we make architecture better for people? And a Corbusier building was built. It's kind of like the father of all of this. After the war, there was this big need for housing developed because homes were decimated. Um, so he built a housing development, basically an apartment building in Marseille that I think it's absolutely beautiful, and I think it's sort of a classic of modernist architecture. But the idea behind it was that not only would it be housing, but it would be an entire village, an entire city in this one structure. So there'd be a shopping mall, there'd be a school, there'd be a beauty salon, there'd be a restaurant.
You never have to
You
leave.
never have to leave. All of your needs would be taken care of in this building.
Yeah.
And
It's kind of utopian
it's utopian.
at a
And you
really tiny scale.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And utopias
Compressed
never
utopia.
work.
Yep. Yep.
Designed utopias never ever work.
Yep.
And usually buildings like this, like Marseille, um, originally the people who would be living there um, be very sort of city oriented. It'd be very street level. You know, everyone walking around, everyone kind of integrated with each other. Um, this building was kind of in the outskirts. Again, it's a high rise kind of by itself, so it's isolated.
Mhm.
So what do when you have sort of a community oriented culture that's suddenly put in a very controlled environment in a very limited space?
Mhm.
So there's movies like Shiver by David
Yes.
Cronenberg that also
Yes.
takes place in
Which again, I'm too wussy to watch. But
if
I loved reading about it in your
yeah.
book.
If you don't like body horror, then
I
don't
don't. I
watch it.
don't. I know. I
Yeah.
love the
Yeah.
occult and I'm so wussy about
But
so
not
much horror
grossing.
stuff. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
not good at gross. But carry on, carry on.
That, and also high rise, they are buildings that were built that were supposed to, make people's lives better and more convenient. So all of your amenities are taken care of. You know, there's a clinic in the building. They're usually isolated
Mhm.
in, a little bit further from the city center, right? And the more you depend on amenities to survive in these buildings, the more the building kind of has control over you.
Yes.
And the more you're kind of susceptible to failures of that building. The more you need the building, the more the building becomes your source of survival.
Yep.
And the sort of the real counterpart to that I talk about is the Pruitt-Igoe
Mhm.
housing complex in St. Louis, and how that again was an idealized dream of taking sort of tenement houses and moving thousands of people, mostly Black people,
Mhm.
into this. I think there were 16 or something high rise concrete buildings,
Mm.
building structures.
Mm.
Um, and but of course, they tried to like, we'll make your life better and there'll be a school and there'll be this and that.
Yep.
But you can't erase all of the social problems. You can't erase, economic disparities.
Yeah.
You can't erase, systemic racism. You
Yep.
can't erase all the social problems um, by design,
Right.
by just making the building a little bit different,
Right. Right.
So it's famous for essentially being a failure. And it very quickly, because it was so big, There weren't enough maintenance. There weren't enough people to take care of it.
Mhm.
Because the income level of the tenants was lower, um, they couldn't afford to pay for repairs in the building.
Mhm.
Crime started taking over. The building started emptying out, and there's been more robberies, more violent crime.
Mm.
The police stopped going there.
Mhm.
The post office stopped delivering there, like packages
Oof.
stopped delivering there.
Yeah.
Um, there would be, windows broken, pipes busted in the winter. There's one instance where it was this brutal, brutal, brutal winter. Pipes burst and just ice just coated the whole place in the inside.
Mm.
And the tenants, again, were responsible for those repairs, which they could not afford
Afford.
to make.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
There would be problems with also the elevators were really weird.
Mhm.
Like they didn't stop at every floor. They would stop at every, I don't know, third floor, fourth floor. So there would be instances where you would either have to walk up or down a couple of flights. Um, those elevators would break. The lights would be off in the
Oh my
stairs. Garbage
god.
would build up.
Yeah.
Um, all of these really kind of scary things happening in the deterioration of this house. Within the movie High Rise, is in the book
Wow.
High Rise. They talk about
Wow.
the elevator failure. They
Yeah.
talk about the broken
So am I
windows.
remembering, Leila, you brought up Clockwork Orange earlier. Was that
Yes.
filmed at these houses or was that the
No.
Marseille house? Or am I
Yeah.
confused? I'm conflating them
Oh,
all.
yeah. Clockwork Orange was filmed in Thamesmead in
Okay.
England. And that was
Okay.
another utopian, architectural
Brutalist.
brutalist concept
Right.
where, again, it was outside of London.
Mhm.
Um, there would be shops, there would be the pub.
Yep.
All your needs would be taken care of,
Yep.
right? Um, well, the transit system didn't go to Thamesmead. There was transit issues.
Yep.
So it was harder for people to go back and forth.
Mhm.
They arranged the building so there were kind of above level, like there was parking, like on a street level parking situation. And then the entrances to the buildings would be above that, which essentially created this maze of darkness on the
Yeah.
street
Oh my
level.
gosh, Leila,
Right?
it's
It's
so
so
upsetting.
creepy. It's so
Well,
disturbing.
another thing I was struck by, and we'll move on from brutal houses in
Mhm.
a moment, but I was really struck by how you write about these houses often as like they're fortresses, but they're also kind of these like mausoleums or
Mm.
tombs.
Mhm.
Um, and I don't want to give too much away, but the section in the brutal houses chapter where you write about Frank Lloyd Wright
Mm.
and I mean,
Yeah.
I'll just tell it really
Yeah, yeah.
quickly, which is, I mean, I love his architecture. I think a lot of people are familiar with that style of his.
Yeah.
I did not realize that his family was like brutally murdered.
Yeah.
And then he moves to, was it San Francisco? No,
LA.
LA. He
Yeah,
moves
moved
to
to LA.
LA and starts designing in this more like I guess you could call brutalist adjacent style where
Yeah.
and it feels like I mean, you as you write in the book, it feels like he's inspired by the tombs of, like, pre-Columbian
Mhm.
temples, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
and I love the point you make. You're like, "I can't draw a straight line from the
Yeah.
thing he experienced to him suddenly designing these, like, mausoleums or tombs," but, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
like, is he working something out through his buildings?
Yeah, like, at that time in his, life, his career was a little bit kind of a slump, and he's kind of known for the prairie, and these prairie houses, very low, flat wood houses, or houses made of wood and stone and things like that. Um, again, concrete was new, so I think if he was one of the first to use concrete, um, in residential housing, right? And he was using it as an experiment, right? Because you could mold these bricks into whatever you wanted, whatever shape you wanted.
Mhm.
So his lover and his children, his works studio was at this. It's called Taliesin.
Mhm.
Taliesin, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I don't want to give it all away either, but yeah, a brutal murder happened there.
Yeah.
And he went to LA. He went to California, and saw an expedition on Colombian architecture essentially,
Yeah.
and was inspired by Mayan temples and things
Yes,
like that.
yes.
So if you look at his LA houses, they look like Mayan temples.
Yeah.
They look like
It's
pre-Columbian.
like that ziggurat
Yes.
style.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And with
Which, P.S., the Mayans and the Aztecs, I mean, they did a lot of intense, brutal stuff
yeah.
in those temples,
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
So that's just interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know. All right.
Yeah.
I'm giving myself the chills. And this is the witch wave. So we have to now dive deep on my favorite section of the book. And I love the entire thing. But the section of the book you write called Witch Houses
Yeah.
just filled me with such glee. And I got a preview of this, as did about 200 other people, at the
Yeah.
Occult Humanities Conference that I co-organize with Jesse Bransford every other year, roughly. You were one of our amazing speakers 2 years ago, and you did this whole presentation on witch houses. And it really, I could feel new neural pathways forming in my brain as you spoke. So I was so happy to get more of that in this book. So what is a witch house by your definition?
Yeah. My definition of a witch house is the house is defined by the witch. And these witch houses, I keep using quote marks for people who are listening, not watching. They are usually a house owned by a single unmarried woman, older, unmarried, childless woman, for whom domesticity and child rearing are not the primary purpose. They live alone, and there's a fear of spinsterhood.
Yes.
There's a fear in this country of being an old woman living by herself with cats.
Yep.
The cat lady.
Yep.
And I'm like, that is my dream.
Yeah.
That is my dream scenario.
I mean, honestly, same. And look, I'm a happily married lady, but I'm basically living in a witch house.
Yeah.
I mean, and my husband, we have chosen not to have children. We have cats. When people come to our home, they're just like, oh, it's clear that you're living your own weird little way. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I can relate very much to this archetype. That's for sure.
Yeah.
And I love some of the examples you bring up. I mean, some, quick, obvious ones are like Miss Havisham, Norma Desmond. I love that you bring up Auntie Mame.
Oh, that's a witch
That
house.
blew my mind because I was
yeah.
like, of course, she's this bon vivant, older, single woman.
Yep.
And she just decorates however the fuck she wants. She doesn't have kids.
Kind of magically. Her home just transforms different styles with kind of seemingly no effort.
Yeah.
And it's not only that, she kind of forms her own family in the way that makes sense for her, that makes her happy. Like a coven.
Yes.
It's a collection of people that are important to you.
Chosen family.
Your chosen family.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the house is for her. It's not for other people. It's not for entertaining necessarily. It's not to make other people happy. It's not to look impressive. It's for that person to do whatever it is they want to in that space, regardless of what anybody else thinks.
Yeah. It makes me think of, and you don't write about this one in the book, but it made me think of Harold and Maude a little bit, like Maude's house.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
No.
No,
I mean,
my mind is going, oh my God, that's totally a witch house.
Yeah, because
that's a good one.
she just so lives on her own and obviously then starts, having her own sexual escapade with a young man, which is also very taboo.
Yeah.
But there are 3 that you write about, and hopefully we'll have time to touch on all of them. You blew my mind when you wrote about Grey Gardens as a witch house and when you first presented it at the conference. So talk about that. Talk about Big and Little Edie as witches.
Yeah. I won't give a whole summary of the documentary because I think it's pretty well known.
I'll just jump in and say,
yeah.
Grey Gardens, it's one of the best documentaries ever made. And it's essentially about, they're Jacqueline Kennedy's cousins.
Yeah.
And so they come from wealth. They live in this mansion, essentially, but they can't afford upkeep.
Yeah.
It's a mother and a daughter, both named Edie. And so the documentary is just the 2 of them living in this decaying, kind of disgusting mansion.
Kind of squalor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But having a fucking ball doing it.
Yeah.
It's iconic.
Yeah. The thing I love, I'm obsessed with them and their story
Of
in this
course,
house.
of course.
Because when you look at it in the outside, it really is falling apart. It looks disturbing. And in the movie takes place after a renovation. Like their cousin Jackie O saw the house in its condition and
Mhm.
paid to get some renovations done. So before the movie, it was much, 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 much worse.
It was worse
Much worse.
than what I saw in the
Yeah.
movie.
Yeah. It was cleaned up. It
What?
was cleaned up for the movie. Yeah.
Get out of
Yeah.
here.
They moved there, Big Edie.
Mhm.
Um, it was their summer home. Again, they grew up wealthy. She loved it. This is in the Hamptons. And she kind of fancied herself an artist. She loved to sing and she loved to be around artistic people, which her husband did not like or approve of. Um, so she already had this non-conventional kind of bohemian-esque vibe about her. Like she
Yep.
was already not your typical
Woman.
housewife woman.
Yeah.
Right, right. And her husband ended up leaving her. She had very, very little money. Um, Again, I won't get into all the details of how they lost their money, but her daughter moved back home when she was about 30.
Mm.
And their relationship is so codependent. it's
That's a
sometimes
mild way of
it's a
putting it.
mild way of putting it.
I mean, they sleep
Yeah.
in the same bedroom. Though you
It's
bring up
yeah.
that's probably
Yeah,
because it's the
yeah,
only room that had heat in it. It
yeah,
wasn't necessarily as weird
yeah.
as that might have seemed.
But there's holes in the ceiling and there's kind of debris everywhere, but at the same
And
time,
wild animals
raccoons everywhere.
everywhere,
Yeah.
just fucking filthy
It's
with raccoons, shitty
crazy.
with raccoons. Yeah.
Everywhere. But they're so in their own kind of joyous world. They're not in denial about the state of their home. Um, they sing a lot.
Mhm.
Little Edie is changing outfits constantly. These
Wearing the best costume of the
best
day.
costume. It's
Ah,
so the
as she
revolutionary
says.
costume. Wearing sweaters
It's
as
just like
hats. It's fantastic.
quotes on
Yeah.
quotes.
And it's like this is their world that for some people, they may not understand it. They may not get it.
Yep.
It may not be appropriate. They were accused of being crazy cat ladies, and they were thought of as being like these poor old dears or whatever. They're staunch.
Yeah.
These are staunch women, right?
Yes.
And so to automatically feel sorry for them for the state of their home is missing um, them completely, I think. There's an idea also that um, having your belongings be that important to you. That's the other thing. They were wealthy, but they don't care about their home.
Yeah.
They are supposed to be for money. They're living, this is the Hamptons,
Yeah.
right? Um, but the preciousness of objects, of things, um, are not important to them.
Yeah. It's
You
kind of
know,
zen.
it really is. It really
I
is.
mean, that's
Yeah.
like the loveliest way of putting it,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
they're definitely like living on their own terms.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
makes them kind of witchly.
Yeah. Yeah.
This feminine being who just is unapologetically subversive.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So there are two other ones that I want to make sure we talk about in the witch house section. There's the house in Suspiria, one of my
Mhm.
favorite films.
Yes.
And then there's the house, and I think these are pretty closely related in a film you turned me on to, which is
Mm.
Gretel and Hansel.
Yeah.
I had never seen Gretel and Hansel. It stars Alice Krige. For you Trekkies out there, she was the Borg queen
Yeah.
in, what was it? Star Trek First Contact, I
Yeah.
think. She's also the star of another witch film I love called She Will, which is so
Ooh.
good,
I have to see
and
that.
so underrated.
Okay.
Anyway, but it's a retelling of the Hansel and Gretel story,
Yeah.
and Alice Krige. Alice Krige is Hulda; she's the witch.
Mhm.
And both of these spaces, the dance school in Suspiria and also the house in Gretel and Hansel, I feel like there's like resonance between them in terms
Yeah.
of like, well, why did you include both of them in the witch house section?
Um, Both of them have sort of an exterior purpose or an exterior front, and then a real interior that is sort of the space of power, the space of magic. There's the like in Suspiria, it's a dance school.
Mm-hmm.
And that's supposedly all it is, right? But
Mm-hmm.
when you get into the layers of it, it's a coven, right?
Yes, it is.
And it is so luscious and crazy and
Opulent,
beautiful, opulent.
prismatic,
Yeah.
lurid, gorgeous. One of
Yes.
the most
Yes. And very
beautiful.
feminine in a weird ways.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah.
my fantasy of a
Yeah.
space. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
without, all the nefarious
Yeah.
goings on, but
Yeah.
like just aesthetically,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
lush.
But also intimidating
Mm,
because it is not subtle at all. It's not a particularly warming, homey environment. It feels intimidating,
yeah, yeah.
right?
It's
It's
grand.
grand. And again, it's for their own singular purpose.
Yes.
But it's not like, it's not black, it's not dingy. It is extraordinarily bright and colorful and extreme and patterns everywhere.
Yes.
And it's gorgeous. Which is kind of the opposite of what we think a quote unquote witch house should be.
Yep.
They're supposed to be dark and they're supposed to be, I would almost say humble.
Mm-hmm.
They're supposed to be small or somehow,
Mm-hmm.
like a
Mm-hmm.
little hut in the forest.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in Gretel and Hansel, it's a retelling of Hansel and Gretel, but the house is not made of candy. Which is the big Oz Perkins directed it, and that was the big shift in direction from the traditional story. They're like, they just don't want it to look like another gingerbread house.
Mm-hmm.
But architecturally, it's fascinating.
Oh,
It's
it's so
absolutely
good. It's
gorgeous.
so good.
It's jet black. It's very minimal. It's kind of Nordic in a way.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. It's kind of Nordic and but also kind of a craft house.
It's like pretty
Yeah.
Instagrammable, I'll
Oh,
say.
totally.
Like, you know what I
Yeah,
mean? Like
yeah,
the A-frame, although it's only
yeah.
A-frame, like half of it's
Part of
A-frame.
it's an A-frame, and then there's an extension in the side. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So it is, and also most of these Gretel and Hansel stories or Hansel and Gretel stories, it's sort of placed somehow in the woods exactly when they need it.
Yep.
They run across the house when they're, um, lost, right, starving to death. But their house, Holda's house, um, is the front, the first floor is warm and it's overabundant with food. Like they
Delicious.
walk in and it is this, and she lives by herself.
Mhm.
She lives by herself, but there is a table that is overflowing with food. So it's still that temptation. It's still, providing the thing that they need. In Suspiria, it was all that crazy color.
Yep.
In Gretel and Hansel, it was warmth. It's starkness, but with this warmth interior.
Yeah.
But in the inside, and the house, below the house
Yeah.
where the sausage gets made, so
Yeah.
to speak.
And kind of literally.
Literally, yeah.
In the
In the
basement.
basement.
Yes.
Totally different architecturally. It's very concrete, super high ceilings, very cold, very kind of clinical. But that's the witch space. That's where
Yeah.
the magic happens.
Yeah.
The homey part is the temptation to get the kids in to have their home
This
warming
is
part.
so interesting because you're making me realize that Suspiria, the house in Suspiria and this house, they both have the subterranean space.
Yeah. Yes.
Where the witch really does
Yeah.
her work.
Yeah, there's the
That does
exterior
look
presence.
so different.
Yeah, and then there's the real sort of authentic space below the surface.
Yeah. I mean, I love the entire book, but of course that section in particular just like made me so happy. There are so many other types of houses you cover. Obviously, we don't have time to go through them all. And obviously, we want everybody to actually read Sick Houses, which is
Mhm.
so exquisite. But I did want to circle kind of back to your own autobiography. Like,
Mm.
I understand that your dad is or was an
He's an
architect.
architect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And your mom is or was an anthropologist.
Yep.
Yes.
It
So
kind of makes
I mean,
sense.
it's so perfect, the Venn diagram of it all.
Yeah.
But you also reveal in this book you moved, 14 times over the course of your
Yeah.
life. And I imagine that gives you a unique perspective, all of these different threads of your biography, into homes and spaces.
Yeah.
How has it made you rethink your relationship to home
Mhm.
and haunted spaces or sick spaces? I hope
Yeah.
you live in a
Yeah.
well
Yeah.
space.
Yes.
But yeah, how does
Yeah.
this affect you personally, thinking about all these things?
I'm always fascinated by people who have lived in the same house their whole lives.
Mhm.
So when I was a child, we moved 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, 5 times, 4 times,
Mhm.
5 times. And then I went to college, and then then I moved many other times. But I never really had a home. I kind of had to pick and choose which I wanted to call home.
Mhm.
So depending who I would talk to, if someone said, "Where are you from?" I would say Detroit
Yep.
because the house that we grew up in, the house that we lived in is the one that felt the most like home,
Mm.
is that house.
Why? Why did it feel that way
Um,
more than the other spaces, do you think?
I think we lived in apartments a lot, so this was an actual house.
Mhm.
It also was old. It also kind of had weird secrets, it felt like. There was like what do you call it? Like, was it a dumbwaiter? Not a the kinda chute with the little
Yeah, a
elevator?
dumbwaiter.
One of those things,
Yeah.
which seemed kind of mysterious and kinda
Oh,
creepy. There was a
yeah.
double staircase. It was old, and it felt like ours,
Yeah.
very much so.
Yeah.
Um, and whatever that and it was also probably the time in my life where I was old enough to kinda be wandering around the streets and do my own thing with my friends, but also young enough to be hopelessly romantic and believe in, like,
Yeah.
magic and vampires and
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
So there was this great crossover between, the feeling that this space is mine,
Mhm.
while emotionally, psychically, or whatever, I was starting to grow and experiment and become a person. Um, and you need a safe space, I think. Physically, I think you need a safe space to be able to grow, to be able to
Yes.
experiment, to be able to
Yes.
fantasize and dream and things like that. Because if you don't
Mhm.
have that kind of physical security, um, I think it's lacking.
Yep.
I think you can't really let yourself go in that way.
Absolutely.
Um, so that's the house that feels the most like home to me because of how I felt inside of it.
Yep. But
That's what
that's
made it
so
home.
much about
Yeah.
what your whole book is about. It's like,
Yeah.
how do you feel in these spaces?
Yeah.
Whether it's physically or your
Yeah.
imaginal existence in these spaces, your spiritual
Yeah.
existence.
That's the
It's,
house where, we would do the Ouija board with my friend,
yeah.
where I had an out of body experience
Ooh,
unwillingly,
Leela.
but I did. And yeah, it
In
was crazy.
Detroit, the Detroit
In the
house?
house, yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
I was lying in bed. This is probably going on a big old tangent, but I was lying in bed and I was not asleep and I was just kind of chilling, relaxing, and I felt myself lift out of my body
Yeah.
up. I could see my roof.
Yes.
I could see the street.
Astral projection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That kind of golden thread that they
Yes.
talk about. I
Yes.
saw it and I was hovering and I saw my house. And then I thought, this is kind of scary. And I immediately zoomed back into my body.
Whoa.
It was amazing.
That's incredible. And that's
Yeah.
never happened since.
No.
You do write in the
Yeah.
book, however, and I won't give this
Yeah.
away, and you shouldn't
Yeah.
either because it's a reveal, but you talk about a haunted, potentially apartment you lived in here in New York City in
Yeah.
Brooklyn.
Not too far from here.
Ooh.
Yeah.
And so this is a nosy question. But in our final moments together, I'm wondering, like, what's your relationship like to your home now?
Mm.
And has writing this book made you reorient yourself to your living space?
I would say my space is not sick.
Good.
It's, it
Good.
has its faults.
It's New
I
York City, of course it does.
I live above a guy who plays guitar and sings Oasis songs really loudly.
No. That is
That is
haunting.
haunting. That's my,
Yeah,
that's my
yeah.
trauma.
We
But,
need to banish that
right.
entity. Seriously, I might be able to help you with that,
Exactly.
PS. We'll talk offline.
Oh my
But
god,
anyway,
please, yeah.
in a
Yeah.
in a healthy, safe way.
Right.
Yeah, I promise.
Take whatever I can get.
Exactly.
Um, yeah, it feels nothing about it feels off or wrong, and I don't get that feeling that I know people get. A lot of people get when you walk into a space and it just doesn't feel
Yeah. Gives
right.
you the oogs.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and this is, I think it was built in like the 30s or something like that.
Mhm.
So who knows how many people have lived in that space, lived and died
Yeah.
in that space and what happened in that space. But I don't think whatever happened, I don't think they stuck around.
Good.
At least, or if they did stick around, they don't care about me being there.
Do you have either rituals or items that you carry with you no matter where you're living that make it feel like
Oh,
home?
I think one of the things I love about moving to a new space is I don't know if there's a specific thing, but I love the practice or the ritual of finding new spaces for the tchotchkes, for finding, I have a little, kind of wind up music toy thing
That
from my
sounds
childhood.
creepy, Leila. Is it
It's
haunted?
not
Okay.
haunted.
All right.
It's
Just
not
checking.
haunted.
I don't know with you, Leila. I had to check in.
It is a classic haunted
Beautiful.
object type
Yes,
thing.
yes, 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 yes.
But finding like the place to put this object now, finding the place to hang the pictures on the wall, like where do the things that I love, where are they going to live in this space? And I do love that kind of ritual. Like there's a scene in Amityville Horror really early on where they have to decide like where to hang the crucifix, you know?
Yes,
And I
yes.
love that. I love that moment in moving into new spaces, though. Where do we hang the crucifix?
Oh,
Practice.
fabulous. Fabulous. Do you have a literal crucifix that you
I
hang?
don't. I
Okay.
don't have a crucifix. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, so maybe you're inviting in vampires.
Exactly.
But I feel like that'd be
Exactly.
okay with
I'm fine with
you.
that. Inviting in. It's
There
fine
you
with
go.
me.
There
Yeah.
you go. Well, I'm so glad that you live in a well space now. That makes me
Mhm.
so happy. And I'm just so glad that this book is out in the world. Leila, tell the good people, what do you have coming up?
Mhm.
I know you're going to be promoting the book out in the
Yeah.
real world. I know people are going to want to follow you online and elsewhere.
Mhm.
Just do all the plugging, please.
Well, I'm having a reading, a launch with Morbid Anatomy, and that's going to be at Barrow's Tasting Hall in Industry City in Brooklyn. And that's going to
Yum.
be on the 12th of February. I'm going to be doing a dual reading with a friend of mine who has the book coming out that's very different with his name's Dominic Petman at KGB Bar on the
I
27th,
love
I think
that
that is.
space. Talk about
Yeah.
a good haunted
Right?
space.
That's going to be
Yeah, it's
cool.
filled with ghosts.
Yeah. Those are the two kind of in-person
Mm-hmm.
things I'm doing. Um, I'm on Blue Sky. I used to be on other things,
Yes,
but I'm not on those
same.
things
I've
anymore.
made that migration as well. Yes, yes,
Yeah. I think it's
yes.
just Leila Taylor
Mm-hmm.
at bluesky.com.
Yep. And are you on
Yeah.
Instagram as well?
I'm on Instagram. I'm taking a breather at the moment.
So wise.
Yeah.
Yeah, understood.
Yeah, I'm kind of we'll see how much I'm on Instagram. It probably is fine now, but I'm trying to wean. I'm trying to wean. It's
Well,
hard.
Instagram is now filled with news about the great haunted house that is the White
Oh
House,
God,
which
yes.
I'm sure there's lots to say about the ghosts in there.
Yeah.
My goodness. But
Yeah.
anyway, I'm trying to end things on a positive note, Leila. I'm
Right.
glad you're taking some mental health space away from the things that you need to.
Yeah.
But I'm so glad that you're going to be promoting sick houses. I hope to come to some of those events myself if I'm able
Yeah.
to. And
Yeah.
everybody just needs to get this book, Sick Houses, Haunted Homes, and the Architecture of Dreams. by Leila Taylor. Leila, thank you so much for writing this book. Thank you
Oh,
so
thank
much for
you.
sharing it with me. And thank you so much for coming back on the Witch Wave.
Thank you for having me. This is so much fun.
Yay!